we go. Hello and welcome to this session on infusing trauma-informed considerations into the IEP process. We're so glad that you're here today. My name is Jenna White. I'm here as a parent. I'm not FCPS staff. I'm actually not an educational professional or mental health professional, but I have several roles within the PTA. Most relevant to this presentation today is my position as the Fairfax County Council PTA representative to the Fairfax Trauma-Informed Community Network. So that's a very long title that basically means I represent PTA families on a group here in Fairfax County called the TICN, the Trauma-Informed Community Network. That is our main group that's addressing trauma. I've also started my own group called PACT, which I'll give a little bit more information about at the end. My co-presenter today is FCPS staff, Katie Bazinski, and she's going to introduce herself now.
Hi, I'm Katie Bazinski. I am a school social worker currently assigned to Twain Middle School. And as Jenna said, I am Fairfax County Public School staff. I am also the mental health professional here, and I am one of our internal trainers, not only to train school staff, but very specifically to teach classes here in Fairfax County about trauma. So as we're starting this presentation, we have this great slide. Before an IEP meeting and after an IEP meeting, which really reflects the differences of how you can feel before and after. We all know that IEPs can be a little stressful, and in the middle of an IEP, of course, for all of us, when we're stressed, our cortisol levels go up. We are not at our best because our amygdalas, the protective part of our brains, are activated, and you cannot be in your amygdala and in your thinking part of your brain at the same time, and we need to be in our thinking part of our brain. So we're going to do a little visualization, and I want you to just be still and push your body back in your chair, wherever you are, and take a deep breath. And I want you to imagine that you just received an email or got a phone call about your child's upcoming IEP. And I want you to identify in your body where you might be holding stress or might be feeling any sensations. Now, this could be your first IEP, this could be your fifth IEP. For some of you, those feelings might be rather strong. For other people, not so much. Right? But we do know that IEPs can be stressful, and we want this presentation to help minimize some of that stress. So what we're going to be doing over the next 45 minutes to an hour is talking about various ways that teams can work together to reduce that stress for you as parents, but also for us all to work collaboratively, so reducing that stress for kids in the classroom through this IEP process.
Yes, and I can definitely relate to this photo as a parent. I think staff can as well. I know when I leave an IEP meeting, I'm glad that I'm done, and I know that oftentimes staff have several more IEP meetings to go that day, and it is a very draining process for everyone. Just to share a little bit more about my experience and why I'm doing this presentation, I have two sons. My younger son has had an IEP on and off since he was about 3 or 4. He went through infant-toddler connection and child find. He's had a lot of struggles his whole life with sleep, behavior, cognition, executive functioning, language processing, reading, and throughout his life he's received a lot of services. He's gotten a lot of diagnoses, a lot of interventions, a lot of specialists, a lot of providers. Nothing was really adding up. Nothing was really working until he was about 7 when I learned about developmental trauma. Since then, it's been a long road, but I have tried to learn everything I could about trauma in order to support him at schools. And I hope that from that experience, I've been able to share this information and help others. So I was able to present at this conference in the past, and this year I thought, let's see if we can start talking about IEPs specifically in the trauma-informed lens. And so I'm really excited that the presentation was selected and to be able to partner with Katie and be here today. So our objectives for today are here. If you are here, you're probably already aware, have a good understanding of trauma and its impact on your child. We're going to try to put together a framework around considerations for an IEP, as Katie said, so that teams can collaborate and come together. This is not a presentation where we're really going to get into the technical aspects of the IEP. That's for another day. We very much hope that this lays the foundation for further discussions within the school system and the community. This is the first time, to my knowledge, there's been a presentation for the community on this topic, and I hope it's the start of a heightened focus and more conversations between families and FCPS.
So Jenna just touched upon a little about why we're doing this. We're laying a foundation for future discussions and growth within the community and the school system. But we're doing this, in particular, she and I, because we're passionate about it, and we really consider the IEP a problem-solving process, right? It is a process for us to look at students' needs and to come together as a team to share information, to engage in dialogue, and to problem solve. We know from statistics through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that 1 in 4 students of school age will be exposed to a traumatic event that could have an impact on their learning and behavior. Doesn't necessarily mean that it will, but it could. And so that's a very high percentage. So if we look at a problem-solving process through a trauma-informed lens, we are only going to do right by kids. There is not going to be anyone who loses out from this process. In the last several years, Fairfax County Public Schools and the rest of the community have really tried to have a certain knowledge base among the different community agencies about trauma, a common language and a common foundation. In the schools, we have Trauma 101. I teach a class at both the elementary and the high school level for staff. But the field is constantly changing, and between a constantly changing field as well as kind of juggling priorities within the school system, there are gaps. We have to admit that. On any problem-solving team, you might have people that are experts in trauma and other people that are just getting to the party. So we have to acknowledge that and really try to educate each other about this lens so that we can serve students to the very best of our ability.
And I just wanted to add, from my perspective, when I first started learning about trauma-informed schools, that was about 5 years ago, one of the things that really stood out to me was the understanding that trauma-informed schools are so important because they're best for all students. I hope one day that the principles of trauma-informed schools, things that we're going to talk about today, like safety, relationships, empowerment, trust, and respect, are so embedded in our schools that we don't have to refer to them as trauma-informed. It's just school, but that's part of why we're talking about this today, to help us get there. So while trauma-informed schools are good for all students, as Katie said, there's a large incidence of students that have been exposed to trauma. And so with that, we have this framework of the 4 R's that we're going to use today, looking at how we can focus on the impact of trauma and how service systems may help solve or exacerbate trauma-related issues. This framework was developed by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is part of HHS, to first realize the impact of trauma and understand potential paths to recovery, that first R, realize. The second R, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, and that's trauma that can be happening in students, families, and staff, as well as anyone else who's involved in the system. Next R is respond. So how do we respond? By integrating our knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. And finally, doing all of those 3 things while resisting re-traumatization of everyone who's involved. This can sound fairly straightforward, but to do this well really is a challenge. When fully understood, this framework gets to the heart of key issues like making team members, everyone at the table, feel safe, how power can be distributed equally or equitably, and truly supporting everyone at the IEP table. So with the first R, we first have to know what this is. All the people in the system, or in this case, in the IEP process, have a basic realization about trauma. They understand how trauma can affect children, families, groups, and communities. Children's experiences and behaviors are understood in the context of coping strategies designed to survive adversity and overwhelming circumstances, either current or past. Realizing trauma, what it is, how it affects people, how many people are affected, and how to heal is a very broad topic in and of itself. There are some other sessions at this conference that you can listen to as well to fill in your knowledge on these areas. One is Beyond the Buzzwords, Creating Trauma-Sensitive Schools for All. Another is Building Self-Healing Communities. And then at the end of this presentation, we'll give you some additional resources as well. So from my personal experience with this, I started doing presentations about trauma primarily through the PTA and the community starting about 4 years ago. And thinking about it back then versus how it's evolved, and then especially looking at COVID the past year, it's really become easier in a sense since COVID, because our awareness of trauma is so much higher and we see trauma discussed so much more frequently with COVID. And since COVID, we also have this new common language rooted in public health concepts that we've all really become experts on. And I think some of those can be really helpful in how we think about trauma. So we could think about with COVID, we all have different risk factors. We all have different levels of exposure. If we contract COVID, or we all have different effects. Some people get very ill, very, very ill. Other people have mild effects, and those symptoms might go away fairly quickly. For other people, they have effects and symptoms for quite some time that they call the COVID long haulers. And regardless of our risk factors or our exposure, we know that universally all the things we can do to mitigate the threat. So that framework can really also translate well to thinking about trauma. Similarly, with trauma, we each have different risk factors that we bring. We have different levels of exposure to trauma or experiences that could be traumatic. With trauma, it's the mitigation that is so important. It's just as important to think about the mitigation side of things as it is to think about the exposure side of things. And we can also take universal precautions to try and limit exposures. So we're also each impacted differently by trauma, just like COVID impacts different people differently. Some recover from trauma somewhat quickly. Other people have long-term impacts from trauma. So again, that's just a way to kind of think about the landscape of trauma. And then with this graphic, I like to use it because it's a good way to show the different types of trauma. And all of these types of trauma fall under that first R, that we need to realize that these are all very real. They all need to be acknowledged. And this includes, I wanted to touch on specifically secondary trauma down here near the bottom right-hand corner. Caregivers, educators, anyone in a helping profession is really at risk for secondary trauma. And that's something really important to think about at the IEP table, is people's level of exposure potentially to secondary trauma. Also here, wanted to highlight the groups at the top. So realizing types of trauma, including historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, systemic trauma, and racial trauma. We can recognize that students, families, and staff have been exposed to these types of traumas. And as this graphic shows, people can be exposed to many types of traumas at the same time. Another way to think about and understand and realize trauma is to look at acute versus chronic trauma. An acute trauma is a single incident, so think about a natural disaster, an assault, a car accident, something that leaves one feeling helpless and overwhelms coping skills. These are what we might traditionally think of when we think of trauma. and they have a beginning and an end. That, and opposed to chronic trauma, that refers to multiple events. They could be related or unrelated that occur over time. So this could be continual exposure to things like community violence, extreme poverty, food insecurity, housing insecurity, exposure to substance abuse, all of those sorts of things that can happen in our environments. Within chronic trauma, we have those subsets of some of the types of trauma I just mentioned on the last slide, including historical trauma, racial trauma, intergenerational trauma. All of these are complex traumas that can be simultaneous or sequential occurrences for child maltreatment. Complex trauma refers to things like abuse, neglect, witnessing domestic violence, that begin early in early childhood and are ongoing. Complex trauma refers to multiple traumatic events that occur within a caregiving system, a social environment that is supposed to be a source of safety and stability. So it's a real violation when something that's supposed to be safe and secure is actually the source of abuse or mistreatment. Historical trauma from prolonged events or experiences that have an impact across generations or within a group or community. So we can think about things like assaults on a culture and well-being, things like slavery, removal from your homeland, relocation, displacement, massacres, genocides, cultural and racial oppression. Racial trauma can be interpersonal or systemic. And of course, our educational system is a large system that can expose everyone in the system to the effects of racism, putting people at risk for this type of traumatic response. Intergenerational trauma is trauma that's passed down between the generations. And with all these types of trauma, it's important to note that it's marked by fear or terror and powerlessness. And that's why we talk so much about things like safety, trust, and empowerment as the antidotes to the imprints as these types of experiences. Again, we can realize the many types of trauma and think about how everyone involved in the IEP process may have been exposed to and impacted by these types of trauma. So when we're thinking about all these types of trauma, when should we think about using the trauma-informed lens? It is impossible, after all, to know all the types of trauma and all the ways that trauma may have potentially impacted a child or others at the IEP table. There's some things we can't see, especially for kids who tend to be fighters or fleers as their protective stance. We can acknowledge that families and schools don't have the full picture. In fact, many students who experience trauma are resilient and will not struggle due to their personal protective factors. So they've had that mitigation that really lessens that impact. Our job as a parent-school team is to begin a process of exploration to consider all the issues, including potential trauma exposures. And as I talked about earlier, the idea that trauma-informed schools are best for everyone, if we approach this with a consideration that there's a possibility everyone could have been exposed to trauma, that's when things will change and we start to pay attention to the signs of trauma, we start asking the right questions, and we start interacting with empathy and compassion for everyone at the table. We also have to realize that a child may not have had trauma exposures. We hope that they haven't. That's a positive thing, but that doesn't guarantee that that won't change in the future. They might have some experiences that arise going forward. This isn't something that we can think about that happens to other people. It can and it does happen to many of us. So when we create an environment that creates the conditions and we're ready if a child does experience trauma, then that's that universal precaution approach that can be compared to how we take universal precautions with things like COVID that we mentioned earlier.
So if step one was to realize that trauma is real, and as Jenna said, it could impact anyone, and the results could be small, large, recognizing the actual symptoms in our students, in our staff, in our families is the second step. Okay, can you go to the next slide, Jenna? So this slide is a little overwhelming, but I love it. And here's why. We do not know the specific result of trauma in any particular student, right? It's not every student who's been exposed to trauma shows it in this way. It's varied. It could show itself in cognition. It could show itself physically because of the high cortisol levels that make people sick. It can result in emotional dysregulation, in problems with trust that play out in relationships, with mental health related to anxiety and depression. The results could be many, many things, right? And because every person reacts differently, if they do react and they don't have enough protective factors around them, then it's our job as the team, that problem-solving team, to come together and say, okay, I have a piece of information here. I have another piece of information. It's like putting together a puzzle where we each bring our own piece to the table and we start shifting them around and saying, okay, here's what I know. Here's what I've seen. Here's my experience with this student. How do we form these pieces into a broader picture that then allows us to develop a plan for this child so that they have the best opportunities for learning? Because we do know that the brain is neuroplastic, which is marvelous because that gives us hope for everyone, right? You can have gone through a terrible experience and had some short-term trauma responses, but over time, with the right supports at home and at school in this case, with people on your side sharing the best knowledge, your brain can get out of that loop and you can develop the skills so that this is a short-term impact, not a lifelong sentence. Okay. The first piece, I think, for any parent as you're thinking about your child and you know there's been some trauma is, how do I balance my child's need for privacy with wanting the school to know, right? Who do I share this very sensitive information with? How much do I share and with whom? And as a mental health person in the school, as well as a therapist in my other life, I always tell people I don't need to know what the trauma is in order to be able to help you. And the school does not necessarily need to know what the trauma is in order to be able to develop a really good plan. As a parent, you know that you want to guard your child's privacy, as well as sharing pieces of information that might be helpful in the problem-solving process. And so it is fine for you to do a few things. You may decide, you know what, I'm going to invite to an IEP meeting a social worker or a psychologist as members of that team. Maybe you decide to share with them ahead of time what has occurred with your child and how to share that information and what parts to share with the rest of the team. I know when I do sociocultural assessments with families, I will say, it's okay for you to share information with me that won't go into the report, because as a person on your child's team, it might be helpful for me to know X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't need to make its way into records that will be public knowledge for everyone. You can go into a meeting and say, I have some concerns about my child, and my child has experienced a trauma. I'm not going to share all of the details for my child's privacy, but I would like some people at the table who would have higher levels of expertise. And that is absolutely fine. We do not need to know the details. There might be certain details that you do feel are important to share. For example, if your child has been exposed to sexual abuse or physical abuse at some point, that might be important because certain staff may need to be aware if your child's having certain reactions. But again, as a parent, I would say take that information slow, and as you feel you have a good relationship with the school, you can share those little pieces of information over time. Remember that your child at the age of 18 will have access to their special education records. So, although I don't think most kids will eventually read their records, some might. And so you want to safeguard that information from them as well. I think a second piece of this is, as a parent whose child has experienced trauma, you will have had your own vicarious trauma. You are protecting your child, and anything that impacts your child is going to impact you as well. And so participation in the process itself can be very raw and can be exhausting. And as you are sharing those details about your child, you need to be aware of how tough that is for you and be okay sharing that with the team and setting your own limits so that you're going into a meeting at your very best. And if you need to bring someone to a meeting to help you share this information, that's fine too. You need to take care of yourself so that you can be your child's very best advocate. And having to go over traumas that have occurred in the past, it can bring them back to the present. That's what we know about trauma. It's as if there was no separation. And so recognizing that this process can bring all that back is really essential for you. So at this moment, we started this by doing a brief visualization. And I asked you to think about, you had just gotten a call or an email about your child's upcoming IEP, and to identify the intensity of emotions in your body, as well as where those might be located. So I want you to do another brief body scan and just breathe deeply. Okay. Now I want you to think about, visualize, if I had a magic wand and this IEP process were to go perfectly for me, stress-free and collaborative and just lovely outcomes, how would that look? And put some ideas behind what would need to happen for that process to go well for you. It can be really easy to say, I didn't like this meeting or it felt terrible, but to be able to visualize and put to words what would be helpful is very important. And as we launch on this next part, I want you to hold that, because that may help through our thinking in the next step. Okay, so one of the things that I think is essential for us to remember is, especially if you've had tough IEP meetings in the past, even if they've been as great as they can be, they're still going to be stressful. And what we know from brain science with all of us is that when we're stressed, our cortisol levels go up, our thinking goes down. We go into the amygdala, which is the protective part of the brain, and we go into survival mode. We look for threats. That's what our brain does. And we therefore are not in our prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking part of our brain. Best to go into an IEP with the thinking part of your brain. So in order to bring down some of the stress, I cannot emphasize preparation enough, right? I always tell parents, go do this, prepare with a glass of wine in your hand or a cup of tea at night when there's no one else around, or when you're with your partner or other people who love your child, and you can think freely without any distractions. In preparation for the meeting, you may want to take some notes. You can type them out to share with the team, or you can just take them for yourself. But whenever we're surrounded by people having to think on the spot, our thinking the best. And this is a place you really want to be thorough. So some of the things you may want to think about are, what are my child's strengths? What do I see from them? What do other people see from them? Okay, when are they at their best? Under what conditions does my child function best? And this could be when my child has visuals available to them, when there's a strict routine, when they've had a full night's sleep, when they're with their best friend, when they've had lots of physical activity. Whatever it is in your knowledge base as a parent, knowing your child better than anyone, what conditions result in really optimum performance for your child? Also, what concerns do you have for your child? And those could be related to mental health, those could be academic, those could be behavioral, they could be relational. Any concerns you have, jot them down ahead of time, and they can never be too specific, right? What situations do you particularly see being difficult for your child? Is it when they have to accept criticism? Is it when they're going into a new environment? Is it when during allergy season, right? I'm seeing this a lot with kids now, when they're not getting enough sleep and they're not feeling well. What are those situations, loud situations, that may put them on edge, and therefore may result in problems with learning, may result in behavioral problems? And what have you used at home that you've been helpful? Because often we don't think that things that we use at home can be transitioned into the school, and they often very easily can. If you find that working with your child with Play-Doh is helpful, we can bring Play-Doh to the school, or having a certain stuffed animal available to them at school, or journaling, or coloring, or listening to music. If there are things that make your child feel safe and secure and at their best, we can think outside of the box to be able to how to incorporate that into a plan to provide the optimum environment at school. Also, what do I as a parent need? Right? Do I need more regular communication from the school? Do I need some type of a notebook that goes back and forth between me and my child's teacher so that I know what's happening on a daily basis and I can reinforce concepts? I can help the teacher, and the teacher can help provide me with information, so if my child comes home and they're not at their best, I don't have to try to get from them what happened. I know, so that I can be a parent and not have to be uncovering all of those things. Also, is there any person in the building, an adult or another peer, that really your child shares the close relationship with and makes your child feel comfortable? This could be, you could have a neighbor who works at the school. They could be in the 4th grade, but it happens to be their 1st grade teacher that was with them a few years, or they really just had a bond. It could be a mental health person. It could be a janitor. Who in the school would help your child feel safe and comfortable? And having that ready, even asking your child so that you can bring that information to the planning table, is really essential. And taking notes, I cannot stress enough, is great, because then you don't have to think on the fly.
So we've looked at the first 2 R's, realize and recognize. Now we're going to go into the 3rd R, respond. So now we're really going to start getting into some of the meat of the matter. The IEP team responds by applying the principles of a trauma-informed approach. This means all staff who interact with students take into consideration the experience and the effects of trauma. There are practitioners trained in trauma-informed practices, a commitment to physically and psychologically safe environments, transparency and trust, and that universal precaution approach. So really, the best way to boil this all down, it really can be quite simple if we look at it this way. Reframing the response, shifting our conversations from what's wrong with you, or what's the matter with you? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this to me? Why is this happening? What's wrong with you? Changing that to, what can we do to help you be successful? What can we do to support you? If we truly operate from this space, what can we do to help you be successful? Then we will be responding in a way that supports all children. And along with this reframing, we wanted to touch on understanding behavior. The outdated model of behavior was taught for decades when educators, psychologists, and others went to graduate school and beyond graduate school. It was all really rooted in behaviorism, which was the focus at the time. And from that came an outlook of 4 main drivers for behavior: defiance, escape, attention seeking, or avoiding. But in the past few decades, we have this explosion in technology that allows us to do new research on the brain, understanding that neuroscience, understanding our nervous system, and that's led to new frameworks and new understanding of behaviors. This new framework tells us look beyond the behavior, understand autonomic responses, which just means an automatic response. Now we can think about um, can't versus won't, and start using a trauma-informed lens to look at things like unmet needs, lagging skills, unsolved problems, limiting beliefs, and systemic barriers. If we've realized that first R, that trauma changes the brain, and this can result in those changes Katie talked about on the slide with all the circles, then we can recognize that IEP goals should target skill development and respond with ways that build skills instead of responding with ways that try to control behavior. I included this picture here of a dandelion. It's a good analogy of looking at some of the root causes of behavior. You know, if you're in your yard and you pluck off the top or the top stem of that dandelion, of course, it's just going to grow right back. You have to get down and get to the root of the matter. You can also think of that as a strengths-based approach, which of course is known that is good for all students receiving special education services. So this means asking things like, what skill is the student lacking that may contribute to the behavior? What skills need to be taught? How can we reduce or prevent triggers? All of those things, again, is reframing our response. And to do this, to get to the root of what we see and go beyond behavior and realize the effects of potential trauma exposures, we can do this exercise. We have an example here where we keep asking why at every step. So here we have a student, Johnny, who appears to have a behavior problem. But when we keep drilling down and asking why, we realize, well, he's really disruptive, but he's doing that to avoid work. Why? Well, he doesn't like math. Why? He can't solve the math problems. Why? He can't remember the steps. Oh, so now we've uncovered Johnny has memory difficulties. Now we can start addressing those memory issues and not just looking at the outward behavior. So using a trauma-informed lens is about looking at why we're seeing the behavior instead of what we see.
So if we go back to the definition of trauma, I always think of it as an event or a series of events that rock someone's sense of safety, overwhelms their coping skills, and has an adverse impact on their functioning, right? That's ultimately what trauma is. At the heart of all traumatic responses are safety. If you do not have safety, that amygdala, the smoke detector in your brain, is going to continue to set off alarms, and everything that kids need to do in school, which is all happens in the prefrontal cortex, can't happen, okay? So safety has to be at the heart of everything that the IEP team is considering as a first line defense. And when I say this for the student, but also for you as a parent, because for you to feel that you're an equal partner, for teachers to feel that they're equal partners, for all staff to feel that they're at the table as an equal partner in a safe environment to do their best thinking on behalf of a child, we all have to have that safety that Jenna talked about at the beginning, okay? So as we think this through, safety considerations for family. And when I think safety, I think predictability, right? Because when our brains know what is going to happen next, they then don't have to be scanning the environment and hyper vigilant looking for threats that might come next, which lets your brain kind of go and lets you get in your prefrontal cortex, okay? So safety equals predictability. So certain things to consider in the IEP. One, Very similar to that one pager or those notes that you can take ahead of time is also being able to preview the IEP documents and the agenda ahead of time. As parents, it's important to remember that you have a right to a draft copy of an IEP 3 days before. Now, an IEP is always a working document, and it's never finalized because we all want it until you're there in the meeting, because we all want to add our ideas to it. But a teacher is likely going to take a first shot at it based upon teacher narratives and their experience of your son or daughter, and then they're going to write up a draft. And you, in the privacy of your own home, when there's not other distractions, you can review that IEP, take notes, write on it, put down your own thoughts where your brain is just a little clearer, and you don't have to feel that you're rushed. Unfortunately, I think because my experience, having done this so long, is that IEPs often feel like a checking of the box, right? They're a document that gets done in a certain amount of time rather than that dialogue and problem solving. And we really want to get them back to that problem solving process. Okay, so the second is, which I mentioned, anticipate the impact of the information that's going to be shared. You as a parent have the right to control the flow of that dialogue about what trauma, what specifics are being shared. You can bring other people with you. You can have other people share the information. You can choose not to share that information at all. Okay, that's completely up to you. Have supportive partners in the discussion. Okay, you might have people at the school that you feel more closer to and that you have just a better relationship with because of exposure, but you may also have people in your faith community, a child's coach, a grandmother or grandfather, someone, a tutor, a therapist that also knows your child very well and can come to the table to support you, as well as bring an additional piece of that puzzle to the table to begin to create that bigger picture. Because in different environments, children are going to show different skill sets, and that's fabulous. And so bringing those supportive partners to the table to be able to assist with the problem solving process will create a sense of safety. Also, bring whatever you need to the table, right? If you need to take a break in the middle of the meeting because it's starting to seem like too much, do that. Bring snacks, bring beverages, bring whatever you need, and feel comfortable and empowered to be able to ask for that. Thinking through the notes that you have, I also say, please feel comfortable stopping the meeting. Meetings can be very overwhelming, as Jen has alluded to, and I've seen, and there is no reason to have to plow through. If it feels like you're overwhelmed as a parent or you just want to take a break, you can stop the meeting. You can put it on hold and say, you know what, I'm going to reschedule and come back another day. That is perfectly okay. And if meetings take, I say about an hour and a half is kind of the top. At an hour and a half, we've all been sitting too long. It's fine to press pause and come back another day. Let's hope that we are not doing these virtual meetings for too long. But if in fact you have to do an IEP the rest of this year virtually, feel comfortable asking participants to all turn on their screens. This virtual stuff is very, very difficult. Right now I'm getting this and I get no input from you guys as an audience of knowing what you're understanding or not understanding. And the same thing happens in an IEP meeting. You can ask to see people's faces rather than documents so that you can gauge. You can build connection, you can build rapport, and you can see people's responses, because just being able to see people's faces is so important for feeling calm and safe in a meeting. You have to know who you're working with. And finally, the last piece I would say is feel comfortable as a parent not signing an IEP on any given day. There is no requirement that at the end of the meeting, when the department chair or the principal's designee says, "Are you in agreement with this IEP?" you can say, "I think so, but I'd like to get a copy of this and go home and read it and then get back to you with a signature, or get back to you in this virtual environment with a verbal agreement." Because sometimes we just need that extra space to be able to think. Now, when we're talking about safety considerations for students, we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of a plan. And here I think it's very specific. It's very important to think about the specifics. So if a child, for example, has been exposed to trauma, the seating placement in the classroom is very important. I'll give this as an example. I've worked in the world of special education for a very long time, with about 85 to 90% of the kids I work with having experienced trauma. And often, if a child has experienced trauma, placement in the classroom near walls is helpful, because when a student knows that someone is not going to walk behind them or beside them, their brain can calm down a little bit, because it does not need to be hypervigilant to threat. It doesn't have to worry about someone passing papers or someone passing behind them. So seating in the classroom, perhaps that's close to the teacher, perhaps that's in the back of a room. Giving a child a choice in where they're sitting in the classroom is very empowering for a child. Consider transition activities and how to include predictability, routines throughout that day. And when I say this, could be as a child comes in from a special, from PE, from the morning, right? From lunch, from breakfast, that they are automatically doing some type of activity. It could be a dot to dot, it could be a maze, which is, those are great because those have a hypnotic effect and actually have the same meditative properties as meditation and yoga. But doing a transition activity like that every time can help your child's brain calm down, help them get back into that prefrontal cortex, and therefore more ready for learning. What are spaces and times for self-calming? Some children need regularly scheduled breaks throughout their day and a special place to go in the building. Maybe it's in the classroom, where they have some items that they can begin practicing self-calming. What we often know about our kids who've experienced trauma is that emotional dysregulation is one of their primary deficits, and it can take a while for kids to develop those skills independently. So early on, students may need to co-regulate with an adult, slowly building the skills for them to be able to calm themselves with less and less interaction, so that they are building that skill towards independence, but also being able to co-regulate with the adult, which is a skill that many kids lack. The out-of-classroom scenarios. This again, breakfast, lunch, recess. What do kids seem to have problems in those time frames? Let's define those problems or those issues specifically as skill deficits. What skill do we need to teach, and what supports do we need to put in during those unstructured part of the days? Because if predictability and routine helps with safety, specials and bigger parts of the day with hallways, gym, lunchroom often lose that structure. Alternate ways to respond and participate. In the virtual world, I'm seeing a lot of kids needing to respond with chat. If kids do not feel safe with being able to take educational risks and be wrong, which is part of the learning process, feeling that they're going to be called upon and therefore left exposed to having a wrong answer in class can feel very intimidating to kids. So proactively developing a plan, for example, Susie won't be called upon unless she's raising her hand. And that way she knows I don't have to feel insecure. When I'm confident with an answer, I'll raise my hand and know my teacher will ask me at that point, but I'm not randomly going to be called upon, for example. Individualized tools for executive functioning and coping. This could be things that students have at their desk, that journaling. It could be a visual chart. Jenna and I were talking separately, and she mentioned it helpful for her son, I hope I'm not calling you out here, Jenna, to have a visual chart that he could go through just to kind of help reground and organize himself with executive functioning. And I've used a similar checklist with kids. What am I missing? What do I need on my desk? It helps kids free up some brain space where they don't always have to be worried about missing those things, because it's a chart or a tool right there on their desk that they can rely upon, and therefore it frees up more brain space for actual learning. Consideration of noise, lighting, too many visuals in the room that can be overstimulating. All of these things teams should discuss when we're talking about a student who's been exposed to trauma and maybe exhibiting some learning and behavior problems, because these can all be pieces of the puzzle. For example, I had a student who had been involved in kind of a mob assault type situation, and it took us a very long time to put this together. When she would be in the hallway, not in a threatening environment necessarily, but with kids horseplaying, and there would be extra commotion and kids were high-fiving and there was a lot of movement in hallways during unstructured time, and kids would be kind of yelling at each other, she would get activated and she would often go into fight mode because that was reflective of the trauma that she had experienced. It took us a really long time to put that together, but it was only when we looked at these unstructured periods that became clear.
So as we wrap up this section on respond, we recognize, or I recognize, that what we've laid out today is not what everyone may have experienced. As Katie said, everyone's in their own process on becoming the journey to become more trauma informed. And we have a very large school system. You know, they're really working on getting professional development out to staff, but it is a process. Given that, we did want to touch on how you can respond if you're not getting the response you need for your child. I think one thing we've all learned today is that we all wish we had Katie in our IEPs, and if you don't have a Katie, then hopefully you can use some of this information to help educate your team. And I already hear her voice in my head thinking ahead to some things coming up on our next IEP. But there are some resources that we have here in Fairfax County available to us. We have our ombudsman program. I always have a really hard time saying that word. We have a second person in the ombudsman office just focused on special education. So the website is here, the phone number is here, and then don't forget about the PRC. In addition to the lending library and all the webinars, you can do one-on-one consultations with them to get some support and some recommendations, especially around the IEP process. And then, you know, with my PTA focus, I'm always thinking about advocacy, and we do have several ways in which we can advocate to keep putting the pressure on to keep our system continually working on becoming more trauma informed. We have our special education PTA, our SEPTA, which is also a great resource. If you're looking for advice and support, I reached out to someone from SEPTA today and said, hey, I need a pep talk. And as another parent, she reached out to me and really was very supportive in that way. Reach out to your school board member. You don't have to be an expert on this topic. Just say, we need more of this. We need more trauma-informed IEP conversations and focus. We need more trauma-informed schools. We also have our ACSD, our advisory committee of, for students with disability. They have public comment options at all of their meetings. If you go to FCPS and the website and search under ACSD, you can get more information about that. So just wanted to make sure that we're all aware of these opportunities.
Okay, so we're at 55 minutes, and I think Jenna and I could talk about trauma forever, but we really feel that this next piece is important, and we're not going to rush through just to get it done. So we'll apologize in advance for going a little bit over time limit. But the last R of the 4 R's in the SAMHSA process is resisting re-traumatization. And trauma, re-traumatization, is what happens when we don't do the other 3 parts, right? If we have realized and recognized and responded appropriately, the natural offshoot of that would be that we would not be re-traumatizing students. That said, as Jenna just alluded to, everyone's at a different point, and sometimes kids do inadvertently get re-traumatized as part of systems, right? It could be through the discipline process. It could be as a result of their own behavior, which is very tricky, because sometimes kids, especially if they're fighters, their own behaviors can actually be traumatizing to them, right? So we want to look at what happens when things don't go well. We know the discipline process, schools do their best, and principals have some leeway with certain things and they don't with others, right? There are some times that if something occurs, the system, unfortunately, at this time, hopefully it will change, is built in such a way that certain processes are put into place. But we can look at discipline in such a way that we're thinking outside of the box. So as a parent, I think it's really important, if kids have been, for example, if they're fighters or they're fleers, until kids get these skills, we can 100% guarantee that in a school environment, they're going to fight and they're going to flee again, right? Because they don't have those skills to do otherwise. No matter how much of a great plan we have around them, there's a pretty strong likelihood that in a moment of stress, they're not going to be at their best. And we do not want anyone judging any of us in our worst day ever, right? At our very worst. So thinking ahead that we can assume that these things are going to happen because they've happened in the past and this kiddo doesn't have the skills yet, how do we think outside of the box so that a discipline process, is actually restorative and reparative? And by that, I mean, if a kiddo has stormed out of a classroom, maybe saying not such great words to someone, right, and yelling and screaming in class in front of classmates, they're going to likely, when they've de-escalated, feel a real strong sense of shame. This could be their favorite teacher. These could be their best friends in the world in class, and they've just seen a really ugly side of them through no fault of their own, right? So how do we then repair that so that the student transitions back into the classroom and back to that group of people, having been able to not only keep their sense of dignity, but also to say, I am sorry, I am back, I will try not to do it again. What was the impact on you? And move forward so that they're not stuck in a place of shame and blame, right? And as a parent, you can ask for a restorative practice. We are very blessed in the school system to actually have restorative justice specialists throughout the county who can assist in restorative conversations. And a restorative conversation is one that looks at what occurred, the impact of an event on everyone involved, including the student, the bystanders, the target, and then dialogues around how to move forward. So it's a very forward-looking process, okay? It could also be, how are we looking at restoration if a child has needed to temporarily be removed from a class? How are they passed back in a way that children know what to expect, as well as the teacher and administrators all know what to expect, so that the child can re-enter that classroom in a very predictable way, so that, again, that predictability will create a sense of safety and allow them to transition back into class. As a parent, right, if we can predict that a child is going to have an incident again, discuss with the team about who will call you, because as a parent, you don't want to get those phone calls, right? And your blood pressure is going to go up when the phone rings. You want to know, the person who's always going to call me is this. This is going to be the process. This is what I'm going to hear. This is going to allow me to ask questions, so that you as a parent can also have a sense of safety and get your questions answered, right? So, and your amygdala isn't firing. Finally, if I have found a very useful tool as part of this problem-solving process, is that if you have a child who is often in escalation phase, looking at the escalation cycle very systematically related to your child. And there's copies of them all over the place, and schools have them available. But taking a blank copy of an escalation chart and saying, okay, what does a baseline look for my child? When they're in baseline mode and they're functioning well, what are they doing? What are their go-to strategies? What does the early phase of escalation look like? What does the upper phase of escalation look like? Who should be involved in that process? What does the highest level of escalation look like? What is, at that point, a child is out of control, but adults can still provide a very protective environment that will maybe slightly different for everyone, to then get through that crisis quicker. And that way everyone knows and can share their knowledge of this child for that crisis, so that everyone feels as comfortable as possible knowing that it's coming. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, that's very helpful. I love the part about thinking about who's going to call the parent, because when you see that caller ID, it's definitely a panic moment as a parent. So we're transitioning to our last few slides. We do want to end on that note of hope. And this little graphic here on the right is a nod to the brain plasticity that we were talking about sooner. And here are some of the, just a few of the resources that I mentioned. You can just put these in and Google them. Some of them are books, some of them are publications. But we don't have to recreate the wheel. This is not easy to do, but there's a lot of really great work that's been done out there that we can utilize. And the PRC has many of these publications as well. So we can we can check them out from the PRC. We could perhaps bring them to an IEP meeting. We can give them to our teachers. There's many great things we can do with these tools. And finally, along with ending on that note of hope, what this looks like, this is an example from my son. When he went to middle school, of course, that was a very difficult time for us. Middle school is 6th grade. He's very young for his grade, so that was particularly challenging for us and with his background. And fortunately, he has had a wonderful experience in middle school through a lot of work with his IEP team and doing this very intentional work, all of the things that Katie has been talking about. And so that first holiday, we got the little candy or whatever, and I simply told him, just make a note so they know who it's from. He ended up writing these whole little letters to them, and what really stood out to me is the language that he used. This isn't somebody who usually goes around saying things like this, so for that to really penetrate into his being, where he could then turn around and say phrases, write things like, thank you for always supporting me, thank you for looking out for me, thank you for caring for me. It just shows that level of relationships, of safety, the trust that he feels. And it tells me too that they've created a climate for him where they also talk about these things. They talk very intentionally about supporting each other, about helping each other, about taking care of each other. And that is the environment that's allowed him to thrive so much. So we know that these things are challenging, but they can happen. And I hope for your kids, you're on a journey that will come out with some very good outcomes. So we're going to leave you with our contact information. I do have some information if you want to learn more. Also, if you're interested in an advocacy stance, I mentioned that group pact that I'm working on putting together in addition to working with the PTA. You can follow me on social media and engage that way. And then I want to thank you so much for coming, and let Katie have the last word here today.
I just want to mimic what Jenna said. Thank you for spending an hour plus with us. We were really excited to be able to give this. We are looking forward to additional trainings in the future about IEPs, but we truly hope that this was helpful in giving you some ideas on approaching your next IEP so that it will benefit your child. So thank you for spending the time with us. Okay, done.